Did you miss me?
Are you kidding me?
Hey there guys, my name's Megan if you're new here, and welcome back to Killer Weekend, where each week we'll discuss a new true crime case and you guys can feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments box below. Oh, I really miss doing that. If you like all things true crime news, then please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. You can now also tune in over on Spotify, so please make sure to support the podcast with a big juicy 5-star review. I will leave a small disclaimer, this episode does involve details of violent crime and femicide. If that's a trigger point for you, then please feel free to turn away now. And remember, if you've nothing nice to say,
Shut up!
Hi gremlins, let me paint a picture for you, okay? You're ushered into a dark room. Through the thick folds of a velvet curtain, the aroma of burning incense and fragrance candle wax overwhelms you. Your body feels electric. This is a new experience for you. Half fearful, half flooded with adrenaline, you walk towards the flickering light. Someone, perhaps an old woman, welcomes you in, and without seeing her face, you accept the invitation, taking a seat at a small round table. Looking around, you notice that you're not alone. Multiple trinkets adorn the walls of the tiny shack. A porcelain clown perched on a shelf across from you catches your eye. Amongst the other items, something about this weathered doll grabs you, and although you're unsure why, it won't let go. You only summon the strength to look away when you see an elderly female shrouded in black robes creeping closer. She joins you at the table, and before you've even had the chance to speak, she reaches out and takes your hand in hers. You look deeply into the woman's eyes, hoping to unveil all of the answers to the many questions now circling in your mind. Should you take that promotion at work? Will you meet a tall and handsome stranger before you're 30? Can she help point you in the right direction finally? Well, I would bloody hope so, because she claims to be a psychic, and you, my friend, have just paid a steep £40 for the pleasure of 20 minutes in her company. Yes, my gremlins, you have somehow stumbled into the den of a fortune teller, and even though it started off as a bit of a laugh, you're now hanging on to her every word. Now, when we hear the phrase, the world's oldest profession, I'm pretty sure that collectively our minds all wander to somewhere a little bit more risky. However, did you know that the art of crystal gazing goes back as far as 4000 BC? Throughout ancient Egypt, China, Babylonia and Chaldea, psychics, or seers as they were once known, played an integral part in historical society. The great unknown has struck fear into the hearts of men since we developed opposable thumbs, and here in 2024 we're still no closer to cracking the code of what's to come. Isn't that wild that over 6,000 years after the first psychic reading was documented, our only connection to the future is still these amazing men and women who claim to possess an otherworldly gift? Back in the age where women had no right to vote and their only option was to secure a good marriage and produce a lot of male heirs, it's easy to see how those blessed with the second sight kept their bellies fed and their pockets full. In the 1800s, you were considered a spinster if you hadn't bagged yourself a man by the ripe age of 23, which is just very sad. So, before their prefrontal cortexes had even had a chance to develop, girls all around Europe would line up outside the local clairvoyant's house, hoping to hear the news that their overbearing fathers had been praying for. I would like to preface this next part with the fun fact that I am a believer in all things spooky, okay? I watched The Sixth Sense when I was 8 and it definitely left a mark. With that being said, I'm also not an idiot, and I'm well aware that amongst the few that are truly touched by angels, there are charlatans, aka con artists. As nasty as that is, these people seek out desperation like a shark seeks out blood in the water. But in 1808, a man named Andreas Bichel decided to take things that one step further. In fact, he used the lure of predicting one's future to carry out his murderous fantasies. During his reign of terror, Bichel proved to the people living and working in Bavaria that curiosity not only killed the cat, but several women who just wanted to know when they would meet their Mr. Right. Tonight, everyone, we will be discussing the vile crimes of the Bavarian Ripper. I predict a murder. Andreas Bichel was born in 1760 in the small village of Wetterfeld, located in the town of Roding, Bavaria. Not much is known about Bichel's home life or upbringing, but I think we can safely assume that it wasn't great, as he grew up to be an extremely insecure and timid young man who hated being in the company of other men. In his youth, Bichel, now a labourer by trade, claimed that he stayed away from the local pubs because he wasn't a big drinker, when truthfully it was because his intense feelings of inferiority meant he could barely hold a conversation. He was described as a coward, someone whose inner self-loathing oozed out of them, and he found it difficult to build connections, platonic or otherwise. Bichel continued to keep to himself well into his late teens and early 20s. Whilst most of his peers were moving up in the world, he stuck to observing young women from the shadows. Possibly due to his impoverished background, the quiet loner developed intense feelings of envy directed at pretty much everyone he came into contact with. This wasn't exactly a new personality trait, however. Even as a child, Bichel had a problem with sticky fingers. In his youth, something, be it an object at a market stall or even a wildflower growing on a neighbour's property, would always catch his eye. And even though he knew it was wrong, Bichel couldn't deny his impulse to take it for himself. Petty theft became a way of life, and it was no secret that he was the local klepto, much to the embarrassment of his family. They vocalised that shame daily, which I'm sure only further emasculated the boy who was slowly developing into a troubled young man. Whilst I'm certain that his loved ones assumed he would die alone due to his tarnished reputation, as they say, there's someone out there for everyone, and eventually Andreas Bichel met his match and was married. The couple settled within Regendorf, located in Zeitlarn, Bavaria, and had 3 children of their own. Much like Bichel, his new bride was an introverted soul, and the pair never socialised with the other residents who lived nearby. In fact, documents would later state that they were rarely seen venturing out of their home. Throughout his 30s, Bichel was able to provide for his family by picking up some odd jobs around the village and by working part-time as a fortune teller. Now, of course, we might never know if he was able to communicate with those on the other side, but I think with Bichel's prior criminal history and his status as the neighbourhood shoplifter, we can safely guess he didn't have the best intentions when he cooked up this new venture. As we briefly mentioned, this was the 1800s, and women of that time had 2 options: marriage and babies or destitution. So, When the guy round the corner offers a service in which he will show you the man you're destined to marry, of course that's going to pique your interest. Making a clever match could be the deciding factor in whether you thrived in high society or faded away into extreme poverty. Women all over town soon wanted their chance to sit down with Andreas Bichel and his alleged magic mirror. According to Bichel, he could perform an ancient ritual that would reveal the image of your soulmate before your very eyes. Several young ladies turned up on his doorstep cash in hand, but he didn't want money. Instead, he requested that each of his clients attend their appointment in their finest dress and bring along 3 other gowns as payment for his services. Now, if that wasn't ringing enough Buffalo Bill alarm bells, then the process of this so-called sacred spell certainly would. You see, in order for the enchantment to work, the women had to come alone, have their hands bound, and be blindfolded. Understandably, most ran out of there as fast as their petticoats would allow. Others sadly chose to trust in Bichel, and that would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. It was February 15th, 1808, and Katerina Sidel, known as the Beauty of the Seidel sisters, was passing through Regendorf whilst travelling in Bavaria. During a chance encounter with Andreas Bichel, she makes a remark that she was on the lookout for a husband, and in that moment, he pounced. Much like many other women moving through Europe on their own, Katerina was initially very wary of this offer. It wasn't unusual for lone female travellers to be targeted by robbers, fraudsters, or worse. But something about Bichel's mild-mannered nature made Katerina want to trust him. He appeared to be very shy and could barely maintain eye contact with her. He was, she assumed, a nice, harmless guy, but Andreas Bichel was far from harmless. These two approached the cottage in which Andreas lived with his wife and kids, and as they entered, Katerina was finally introduced to the infamous magic mirror. The seemingly mystical contraption consisted of a thick sheet of magnifying glass sealed with a border of dark wood. For the 19th century, this would have been a rare trinket, and I'm sure you can understand why Katerina mistook it for a magical portal to another world. When Bichel spun the eager singleton a tall tale about the mirror and its origins, she believed him, and tragically, her naivety would be her downfall. Katerina allowed herself to be blindfolded and wrists bound by Bichel, after he explained that if she were to make any sudden movements during the ritual, she could anger the spirits and destroy the mirror. She reluctantly agreed and waited, eyes now covered by a soft cloth-like material, to finally see the image of her soulmate reflected back at her. Whilst completely in the dark, she could hear Bichel shuffling around the room. She asked if everything was okay, but heard no response from Andreas Bichel. She was about to lift the makeshift blindfold from her face when all of a sudden something hard and blunt struck the side of her head. Dissecting Katerina's corpse, Bichel carefully removed her dress and placed it over a chair. He'd been fascinated by the unique texture of the fabric and would later say it was one of the main reasons he picked her out. After he disemboweled her, he then grabbed his trusty axe and chopped her to pieces, throwing her remains in the small shed he kept on the edge of the property. As if this wasn't brutal enough, Bichel then smeared Katerina's blood into the floor, allowing it to soak in like some sort of morbid varnish. He made no effort to dispose of any physical evidence and even stored the 3 gowns he'd received as payment in a drawer nearby. This man was so arrogant that he truly believed he would never be caught. Little did he know that Katerina Sidel shared an inexplicable bond with her younger sister Valberga, and that she would stop at nothing to bring Katerina home. Valberga and her big sister had always been close. They did everything together. So when Katerina didn't return from her travels, she had a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. She'd always found her sister's childlike innocence and willingness to see the best in everyone endearing, but simultaneously she feared that it could also lead her into harm's way one day. Throughout her travels, Katerina had kept in touch with her family via letter writing. Her last correspondence mentioned that she was stopping off in Regendorf. Valberga arrived hoping she would soon track down her sister and that all of her worries would be put to rest. Unfortunately, the only thing the Seidels would be laying to rest was the body of their beloved daughter and sibling. On the 19th of May 1808, whilst in the village where Katerina was last seen alive, Valberga wandered around asking locals for information. On her search for answers, she found herself standing outside a tailor's shop. She couldn't understand why at the time, but something was telling her that she had to go in. Upon entering the small boutique, she encountered the owner, who was working on a distinctive-looking waistcoat draped over a mannequin. Again, for reasons unknown to Valberga in that moment, she couldn't take her eyes off of the tailor's current project. It wasn't until she turned to leave that she remembered why it looked so familiar. The garment was crafted from the same unusual material she'd seen on one of her older sister's dresses. As she took a closer look, she noticed that the fabric wasn't just similar, it was exactly the same. She questioned the tailor on who the waistcoat belonged to which he replied, Andreas Bichel. Suddenly the parts were falling into place. In her last letter, Katerina had mentioned meeting a man from Bavaria who claimed to own a magic device that could show her the image of her future husband. But she never mentioned this so-called oracle by name. Rather than risk her own safety by going to this man's home alone, Valberga smartly contacted the local police. And on the 22nd of May, after hearing her concerning story, they knocked on the door of Bichel. Initially, officers hoped that Valberga's suspicions were wrong. They knew Andreas had a history of dishonest behaviour in his past, but he was a hard worker and it seemed as though he'd turned a new leaf for his family. He was calm, friendly and welcomed officers with a smile, but clammed up slightly when he was asked about his relationship with Katerina. He did admit that he'd given her a reading, but that as far as he was aware, she'd run off with some man right after, with the goal of eloping. To Valberga, this didn't sound like something her sister would do at all. As we said, the Seidels were a tight-knit little family, and there was no way she would have run off into the night with some guy without so much as a letter. Officers agreed and entered Bichel's cottage to see if there was any trace of Katerina. With them, they brought a police dog who would just not sit still. The pup was clearly agitated and was constantly sniffing and scratching at the wooden floors. As they combed through the Bichel family home, police discovered some damning circumstantial evidence. Tucked away in a bureau, they found several articles of women's clothing. Valberga identified a few pieces as belonging to her older sister. At some point during the search, the dog began pulling towards the door, practically dragging his handler off his feet. Assuming he just wanted to relieve himself, the officer took him outside. But he didn't stop there. He eagerly pushed forward towards a small outbuilding at the bottom of the garden. Much to the horror of law enforcement and Valberga, hidden inside were the dismembered remains of not only Katerina Sidel, but another young woman who'd been missing since 1807. Barbara Reisinger was a girl from the village of Leusenreich in eastern Bavaria, and in the summer of 07, she had journeyed to Regendorf looking for a job. She'd been lured to the countryside home Bichel shared with his wife and 3 kids, under the impression she was interviewing for a housekeeping position. Andreas claimed that his partner was overwhelmed with her household duties, and that with the extra money he was bringing in as a fortune teller, they could now afford to bring on some additional help. However, shortly after Barbara had arrived, things took an unusual turn. Bichel offered Barbara a free reading in front of his magic mirror, and again, much like Katerina, she naively accepted, allowing herself to be bound and blindfolded. As the young woman eagerly awaited her date with destiny, Andreas Bichel returned with a large kitchen knife, and without warning, he raised it overhead, plunging it into Barbara's chest. As she dropped onto the floor, choking on her own blood, he tore the dress from her body before cracking into her breastbone and ripping out her heart. Bichel's cruelty knew no bounds, and shortly after the murder, he got in touch with Barbara's parents and spun them the story that he was a distant cousin of their daughter and that she had fled Bavaria with a rich, handsome suitor. Unlike Katerina's family, the Reisingers were very uneducated and didn't really care much for the well-being of their child. So, they didn't question Bichel's claims and even sent him the rest of her clothing when he requested it. Initially, Bichel denied any involvement in the vicious slayings, sticking to his story that both women had disappeared with their prospective new husbands. Investigators continued to push him, highlighting the holes in this fairy tale romance theory. They wanted to get the truth out of Bichel, but they had to be very cautious about how they went about it. Using physical torture as an interrogation method had been outlawed in Germany on July 7, 1806, so if law enforcement were going to get a confession, they'd have to do it the hard way. Despite the fact that 2 rotting corpses had just been found in his back garden, a twisted Bichel was still under the illusion that he could evade justice and that this would all go away. Teresa Seidel, Katerina's older sister, identified a handkerchief discovered in a small box on the property as having once belonged to her little sister. Police also located several pieces of women's jewellery, later tied to both victims in the same box. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Bichel was the one responsible for these killings. They just had to get him to admit it. Days after the bodies were uncovered, investigators returned with Bichel, hoping that by revisiting the scene of his crimes, it might spark some kind of emotional response. At first, it appeared as though Andreas was physically uncomfortable. He was practically shaking as officers walked him through the small cottage. And then, just like that, one by one, his darkest secrets began to spill out. He said that yes, he had committed the murders, but that both had occurred within a moment of passionate rage. He initially claimed that he'd fought with both of the victims, but couldn't tell officers why. Then, as they led him outside to the dump site, he changed his story once again, finally stating that he acted on sheer impulse after forming a strange fascination with both Katerina and Barbara's clothing. Bichel claimed that he chose to kill to gain access to the garments each of the women wore, but how he treated their remains would suggest otherwise. The amount of overkill was nothing short of heinous, and it was clear that the perpetrator of these crimes took their time and even possibly enjoyed playing with the bodies. When pressed harder on his true motives, Bichel, who was basically salivating at this point, confessed that he may have eaten parts of his victims. The case was a slam dunk, and Bichel was taken into police custody and charged with the murders of Barbara Reisinger and Katerina Sidel. For decades, those who worked on the case assumed that Andreas had confessed out of guilt or remorse. However, since then, our insight into human psychology has improved, and I think we can safely say that Andreas Bichel was a psychopath. His hatred of women probably stemmed from the troubled relationship with his own mother, which also may explain why he felt the impulse to destroy his victims' reproductive organs, much like fellow 1800s serial killer Jack the Ripper. The fact that he was unable to confront his victims unless they came alone and allowed him to bind their hands and blindfold them also speaks volumes. Bichel felt a desire for control, possibly due to experiencing a lack of control in his childhood. He not only kept trophies from his crimes, but he would re-gift these items to his wife, and whilst she wore them, he could continue to relive the thrill of taking a human life. He shares distinctive patterns of behaviour with notorious serial murderers such as Dennis Rader, Peter Sutcliffe, Edmund Kemper, and the Axeman of New Orleans. So it makes sense that those in law enforcement always believed that there may be more victims out there. I mean, had it not been for the perseverance of the Seidel sisters and one very determined police dog, Bichel would have probably gone undetected for years. Actually, fun fact, this was the first murder on record to have been solved with the help of a canine companion. Dogs had previously been used by authorities solely for security purposes, and trained sniffer dogs wouldn't really become a thing until the late 1880s. So, this little floofer, whose name remains a mystery, was a trailblazer for the rest of his furry, crime-solving friends. Thankfully, due to diligent police work and the unbreakable bond of three sisters, Andreas Bichel was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to death by beheading. His life ended on June 9th, 1809, and with it, his reign of terror. A great deal has changed in the last 215 years since Bichel was executed, but the lure of the supernatural has remained. Still to this day, us ladies seek out the local spooky wife in the hopes that they can shine a little light on the path ahead. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a bit of harmless, otherworldly fun, but it's always good to keep in mind that not everyone has your best interests at heart. So, just remember, stay safe and maybe don't go alone, because if you stumble into the wrong place, you might not have a future to tell. I hope you found this week's episode informative, and if you did, please don't forget to smash those like and subscribe buttons. It really helps this wee channel of mine. If you're a fan of all things supernatural, UFO, conspiracy theory and all that good stuff in between, then check out our Fact or Fiction horror podcast, Here She Lies, over on Spotify every Wednesday. I'll pop the link in the description box below. Before I pop off, I guess it's as good a time as any to address all of the burning questions that you had for me during my 6-month hiatus/mental breakdown. So I'll just run through these, okay? No, I'm not dead. No, I have not left my husband, and no, I haven't given up on YouTube. For those of you who've watched the channel for a while, you will know that I'm constantly sick. I have chest infections, sinus infections, every infection, not sexually transmitted infections, because I'm not about that crazy girl life. But long story short, I have now been given a diagnosis and the proper treatment. Fun fact, it was my sinuses all along.
I'm shocked. This is shocking news.
So don't worry, we are thriving, we are surviving, and with that being said, please remember I love you all so much, so lock your doors, don't talk to strangers, and always check the back seat before you get in your car. See ya! Big kisses.